Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back to another session. Today we're going to be having a look at the fiqh of menstruation. Menstruation is of the most unclear of chapters, of the most tremendous of important matters to be mastered for many different rulings like divorce, waiting, period, lineage, permissibility of intercourse, praying, fasting, reciting the Quran and touching it, spiritual retreat, entering a mosque, the tawaf of Hajj, and establishing puberty. So as we can see, it's of the most tremendous importance that a woman understands and masters the subject of menstruation. And husbands also, and sometimes even fathers and sons, because women don't have access to education, sadly, in some parts of the world to this day. And it's of the most important of matters that a woman masters this subject, because many further rulings are off the back of this. For example, to divorce a wife during menstruation is sinful. To engage in sexual intercourse during menstruation is sinful. Determining the end of a waiting period, this is only known if a cycle is known. Ruling for fasting and prayer affected for menstruating women. Do not have to make up missed prayers, does not need to make up missed fasts. A woman who's on her menstrual cycle, when she comes off the cycle, she doesn't need to make up any prayers that she missed, but she does need to make up the fasts, because the fasts only come once a year. We'll mention this as we go on. So I'm going to refer back to the notes of my teacher, and I've basically borrowed mostly from his slides, because the subject in the book is told. It's not as straightforward in the book, so I've taken the notes of my teacher and then we're going to refer back to the book towards the end. So basically there's only two states for a woman: bleeding and non-bleeding. She only has two states. She has a state where she's bleeding, or she has a state where she's not bleeding, and the period in between is called a tahar, from the word tahara. Now there is blood with legal rulings, right? It's called menstruation, haid in Arabic, and lokia, which is called nifas. This is the bleeding after birth. And then there's blood without rulings. So this is called abnormal bleeding, istihada. It's called abnormal uterine vaginal bleeding. So remember this terminology. Now, women in menstruation and lokia may not pray and does not make up missed prayers. The prayer has effectively dropped from her. So for example, if a woman is on her menstrual cycle for say 7 days, once she comes off the cycle and she resumes praying again, she doesn't need to make up her prayer for those 7 days. This is considered a form of hardship for her. She may not fast, but make them up. Also, a woman doesn't fast during her menstrual cycle, but upon finishing her menstrual cycle, if it was Ramadan, then those fasts she needs to make up. So after Ramadan, she would make up those fasts outside of the menstrual cycle. She's not to enter a mosque, not to recite the Quran, but may look at the Quran and read with her mind. So she can look at the words of the Quran and she can read them in her mind and she can listen to them, but she cannot recite them. However, she can recite Quranic du'as that are from the Quran, like Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana, and du'as like that, because they're not intended as Quranic recital, they're intended as making a du'a. Students and teachers are allowed to recite word by word in extreme hardship, to read them, allowed to follow the Maliki school. So if you've got a teacher, a female teacher, that her livelihood is based upon teaching the Quran to others, in that situation, according to the Hanafi ulama, she can break down the passages of the Quran. So for example, Alhamd Lillah Dhalik Al-Kitab. She cannot perform tawaf, she cannot have intercourse, husband may not touch her between navel and the knee, skin to skin, with desire or without desire. So from the navel to the knee, to the bottom of the knee actually, a husband cannot touch her skin to skin. Although if they're fully covered, then there's not a problem, whether it's with desire or without desire. If covered, he may touch her. Upon completing of bleeding, she must perform the ritual bath in order to resume daily life. So it's a similar ruling for men in major ritual impurity. So for example, if somebody is in major, men or women, if they're in major ritual impurity, they can't pray, they can't fast, they can't touch the Quran. So except for fasting, they can do suhoor, then keep the fast. Allowed to have intercourse even before having the obligatory bath. So a woman is allowed to have intercourse before the obligatory bath, and we'll have a look at that further down the line. Even though propriety would recommend that she take the obligatory bath, but if she weren't to take the bath, once she's finished her cycle and there's no more bleeding, she is allowed sexual intercourse with her husband. There are a few conditions attached to it, which we're going to look at towards the very end. So let's have a quick review. So we have blood with rulings, which is known as haid and nifas, lochia and menstruation. And then there's blood with no rulings, which is known as istihada, abnormal vaginal uterine bleeding. Istihada has the ruling the same as a nosebleed. So you basically renew your wudu. So it's like you're having a continuous nosebleed, and there's some rulings attached with that. You just basically keep renewing your wudu, and we'll discuss that inshallah when we get to the part on chronic excuse. So again, she may have intercourse, she may recite the Quran, must pray and fast. What is menstruation? The definition is, it is blood from the uterus, not from anywhere else, from the uterus that exits from the vagina from a female who has reached 9 lunar years of age and is not caused by an ailment and not during pregnancy and not after giving birth. So this is the definition of a woman's bleeding, her monthly cycle, and if it doesn't fit this description, then it's known as abnormal bleeding. So number one, blood. Any colored discharge that exits the vagina. So it could be red, black, greenish, brown, yellowish, it could be streaked, it could be spotted. Any blood that exits a woman's vagina is menstrual blood, is considered menstrual blood, unless she knows otherwise. Again, from the uterus. If this blood did not come from the uterus, it's not menstruation. How do we know it's not from the uterus? We don't know. We assume it's from the uterus unless she's sure, based on past experience and knowing her body, that it's something else. But we're not supposed to check, we're not supposed to go and ask doctors. A woman assumes that it's from the uterus. Through the vagina. Not considered menstruation until it reaches the edge of the vagina or exits. If merely felt, it's not menstruation. From a female older than 9 years of age, that's 9 lunar years and 8 years and 9 months in the Gregorian calendar. So any bleeding seen before the age of 9 lunar years is not menstruation. If a woman does bleed prior to this age, 9 lunar years, then you need to take her to the doctors and get her checked out, because it's not menstruation, it's going to be some other form of bleeding. And we term it abnormal bleeding. Not caused by an ailment. If vaginal bleeding is caused by an illness, it is not menstruation. Bleeding in expected time, assumed menstruation. Not expected to ask a doctor. So there's no need to ask a doctor, right? A woman normally knows from her habit, from her regular cycle, if it's menstruation or not. If it's known, then it's not menstruation. Not during pregnancy. So there's no menstruation for pregnant women. Any bleeding seen is istihada, abnormal bleeding. If she sees bleeding during pregnancy, then note it on a calendar in case of miscarriage. So this is very important. It's obligatory for a woman to note down and make a note of a regular habit. She needs to do this every month. Not after giving birth. So this blood after birth is called lochia, and it's not menstruation. It's not known as menstrual blood. Important details. So menstruation. Now, menstruation has a minimum length and a maximum length. The minimum length is 3 days. So anything less than 3 days is not considered menstruation. It's called abnormal bleeding, istihada. And anything more than 10 days, again, is called istihada, abnormal bleeding. So if any blood flow between 3 days to a maximum of 10 days is menstruation. If she has anything otherwise, then there are different rulings attached. We don't consider it menstruation. So the least tahar separating menstrual periods with no blood flow is 15 days, 360 hours. So tahar is the period between cycle, between menstruation and menstruation. So the period, the least of that is 15 days. So a woman, if she starts to bleed, so if her cycle ends on day 10 and then on day 15, 5 days after her cycle ends, she starts to bleed again, right? And she thinks that's her cycle starting again. That's not a cycle, it's known as abnormal bleeding. The minimum amount of time has to be 15 days. Because obviously a woman can't have a period every week, and some bleeding in between is not considered menstruation. Again, it's called abnormal bleeding. So let's have a look at some examples now. So example 1, Anne sees bleeding for 7 days after a tahar, no blood flow exceeding 15 days. So she's had a tahar, she's had a dry run, she's had a period of 15 days, and then after that she notices some bleeding, and she bleeds for 7 days. Okay, so she assumes it's menstruation at the first sight of blood. So that means now that all the restrictions apply on her. She can no longer pray, she can't fast, she can't read the Quran, she can't enter a mosque, and no sexual relations. On the 7th day, she notices that she's clean. So on the 7th day, she performs ghusl and resumes her prayer, and all restrictions are lifted, with some conditions on sexual intercourse which shall be discussed later. So this is a fairly straightforward, simple case. She bleeds for 7 days, and then she stops bleeding, right? She performs the bath, and then she carries on her life as normal. And after 15 days, could be 20 days, could be longer, whenever her cycle, her regular cycle starts, it starts, but it always starts after 15 days. So when she gets the bleeding, she knows that this is now menstruation, right? And then obviously it's going to be 7 days again, if it's her regular habit, and then again she'll stop bleeding and have a bath, and then carry on again as usual. So this is a fairly straightforward case of a regular woman called Anne. Let's have a look at another example. Bleeding does not have to be continuous and can be spotted. This is what we're going to look at in the example now. Elizabeth sees blood for 2 days, followed by no blood, then a spot of blood on day 7. What should she do? Because remember, we said the minimal time for bleeding is 3 days, right? So she's only bled for 2 days now, right? So in the first instance, she assumes that she stopped bleeding, so it was abnormal bleeding, right? She stopped bleeding now. So then she has a bath, and she will resume her daily life again. She'll start to pray, read Quran, and everything else. But what happened is, after 5 days, on day 7, she sees blood again. Now, we mentioned that the maximum is 10 days. So even though she stopped at day 2, at day 7 she realized that no, in fact, even though there was a gap, it's all considered menstruation. So on day 10, when she realized she's bleeding again, that's all considered menstruation. So obviously the prayers don't have to be made up, because there's no prayers for a woman who's menstruating. But if she happened to fast during those days, then those fasts would become null and void, and she'd have to make those fasts up again. So let's have a look at another example. So Edith sees blood for 4 days, followed by no blood, then a spot on day 7. What should Edith do? So 4 days, she's within the menstruation period now. She's safely within, so it's 4 days, she's seen it. Followed by no blood, then a spot on the 7th day. So what should she do? Her bleeding was for more than the 3 days, so she assumes it's menstruation. And when the bleeding stops on day 4, she showers and resumes praying. Then, when she sees a spot of blood on day 7, she knows that the days in between when the menstruation. So the same thing. She knows, she's seen another drop of blood. She knows that the days in between when menstruation. And then the same thing happens. If she happened to fast, she'd have to make those fasts up. And again, it's for a total of 7 days. After day 10, if she were to carry on seeing any blood, it'd go up to a maximum of 10 days. Anything after 10 days, then that would no longer be menstruation. So it's important, a woman must note down the length of the menstrual period. Why? Because it helps her establish a habit. So she needs to record the date and time her period starts, and the date and time it stops. So let's have a look at normal versus abnormal. We mentioned this, and we're going to go through a review again. So menstruation period between 3 to 10 days is normal. Tahar lasting longer than 15 days is normal. Her life is normal, healthy, and life is easy. Abnormal case would be if a period lasts longer than 10 days or the tahar lasting less than 15 days. In this situation, her bleeding is considered abnormal, and she'd have to maybe sometimes ask a scholar on how to deal with these issues. She may need to turn to people for advice. So a simple abnormal case is Agatha sees 11 days of bleeding. So straight away we know that after day 10, that extra day is now abnormal bleeding. Once it exceeds 240 hours, then it's no longer menstruation, which is 10 days. So on day 10, she has a shower and prays fasts even if she is bleeding. Right? So even if she's bleeding now, she basically does the bath for purifications. She's pure and she can resume her life again, even though she's bleeding, because now we treat that bleeding as a nosebleed, which is each time it happens, you make wudu again. And if it's chronic, at the end we're going to discuss what to do there. So menstrual bleeding has passed over into abnormal bleeding. So in this case, obviously, it passed over into abnormal bleeding. When did the abnormal bleeding take over? So this is also interesting. So even though 10 days have elapsed, and on day 11 she stopped bleeding, right? But how does she know that her menstrual cycle was actually 10 days? Or was it 7 days? Or was it 8 days? Or was it 6 days? How does she know this? Where did the abnormal bleeding take over from the regular menstruation, the menstrual bleeding? Now, in instances like this, she needs to refer back to her notes, right? This is why we say it's very important for a woman to write down every month the time and the date she started, because she can generally see trends of what's happening here. So in a case like this, she refers back to her last regular habit. She needs to know in order to pray the mispraise. A woman's habit informs women about her previous menstrual cycle. The habit is the last regular menstrual period and regular tahar. It's obligatory to keep. So these notes would tell her when she had her last regular period, and that is what she'd look at. So if her cycle was 6 days, then she'd know that from day 6 to day 10, right, which is within the 10-day period, was actually abnormal bleeding, and then day 11 was abnormal bleeding as well. So she'd know that she needs to make up the prayers for those days. That's why it's obligatory for every woman to keep a record of her habit. She must record the date and time of every sighting of coloured discharge. In case of an abnormal menstrual period, to consult a scholar. So some cases get a bit technical, and it's advisable to consult a scholar on this, would be able to advise her exactly on what to do. Without details, again, without having those regular details from month to month, even a scholar would need to know more in order to give her the correct information. All coloured discharge is considered blood, we mentioned. And oxidization, how does a woman know for sure? So there's something that's known as the kursuf. It's basically a piece of cotton or similar material that a woman uses to check on the colour of her blood. So she would hold that cloth close to the opening of her vagina and secure it there, and basically take it away and look at the colour. She wouldn't leave it lying around for 5-10 minutes and then look. Why? Because reaction with the oxygen could change its colour. So that's why we don't use pads to determine what colour it is. Why? Because the pad, actually, there's always a slight gap between the pad and the vaginal opening, and as a result oxygen circulates, and that can have an effect on the colour. So it could darken. A woman may actually be coming off her menstruation, but the pad will keep showing her that her blood's dark, her blood's dark, her blood's dark. So in instances like this, vaginal discharge. So menstruation is defined as blood that exits from the womb of a healthy woman having neither disease nor pregnancy after the age of adolescence. The minimum duration for menstruation is 3 days, while the maximum is 10 days. Its average then is between the two, i.e. around 5 days, as mentioned. If the bleeding is for less than 3 days or more than 10 days, then the excess blood is not menstruation, rather it is abnormal bleeding. During the period of menstruation, any color seen is considered menstrual blood, even if there are intermittent breaks from bleeding during the period. Hence, she may not pray or fast. The fasts must be made up if during Ramadan, as opposed to the prayers. The following things are also impermissible during menstruation: sexual intercourse, tawaf, entering a mosque, being touched between the navel and the knee without a barrier, although if a barrier, then there is no harm, even if with pleasure. Reciting the Quran, touching a copy of the Quran, unless a non-attached barrier is used. Now, I mentioned to you a slight clause that if a woman comes off her menstruation, can she have sexual intercourse or no without having a shower? Technically she can, but there's 3 conditions that need to be fulfilled and looked at. So if her period ends within 10 days, but after the duration of her regular period, she may not have intercourse except after one of 3 things. So one of the reasons why she may not have intercourse unless after one of those 3 things is because if her regular habit is, say for example, 8 days, and she comes off on day 6, and she's totally stopped bleeding, it's assumed that she may start again. It's just a temporary phase and she may start again. Unless she does one of the following. She performs ghusl first, so she has the obligatory bath first. Or she performs tayammum if there is a valid excuse, as well as praying a ritual prayer with the tayammum, even if it's a nafil prayer. Because we mentioned before that in and for itself, a tayammum isn't as strong as a wudu. It's a replacement and it's not as strong. So she needs to do something with it. She needs to pray a nawafil first. Or missing a fard prayer, which occurs if her period ends with enough time to at least perform the ghusl and say the tahrima, i.e. the word Allah, before the fard prayer time expires. If that occurs, it is permissible to have intercourse with her afterwards. So in this instance, if she misses the fard prayer with this particular condition, it's permissible to have sexual intercourse with her. Obviously, we're not talking about deliberately missing prayers, but if her menstruation cycle ends very close to the start time of the second prayer, she's obliged to pray. The obligation now has fallen upon her, so she needs to make the purificatory bath and pray as quick as she can. Now, if she cannot make that prayer, obviously there's no sin upon her, because she's not superwoman, she can only do things so fast. But in this condition, if she were to miss the prayer with the following condition, then she's allowed to have sexual intercourse. Or reason 3, if, however, the time between the ending of a period and the expiration of the prayer time is very slight, such that she does not have enough time to even make the ghusl, so she has no time at all, then she is not considered to have missed the prayer, because she didn't have enough. Realistically, she didn't have enough time to do anything. So in a situation like that, if the fleeting moment of the prayer time goes past, she's not considered to be someone who's missed the prayer. And intercourse would remain impermissible for her until in this situation she has the bath. If her period goes past 10 days, it's permissible to have intercourse with her as soon as it passes the 10th day, due to the certainty that the menstruation is complete and then the extra bleeding is abnormal bleeding. I mentioned this before. If it was less than the period, then she can't, because you assume that it could start again. If it goes past the 10 days, then it doesn't matter what bleeding she has, it's considered abnormal bleeding, it's no longer menstrual bleeding. The minimum duration of tahar, time of no bleeding in between cycles, is 15 days. There is, however, no maximum unless she has continuous bleeding, in which case a standard period needs to be established. So the minimum is 15 and there's no maximum. It could be 20 days, it could be 25 days, it could be 30 days, it could be a 40-day cycle. Allah knows the situation that He's put some women in. So in this situation, there is no maximum unless she has continuous bleeding, and then in that situation a tahar time needs to be established. Postpartum bleeding, lochia. So lochia is defined as blood, again, that comes after delivery or after most of the baby has exited. So most of the baby would be 50% of the baby. That would be half of its body if it came out head first, if it came out feet first, and then it would be up to the stomach. It would be all of the legs, and then that would be half of the baby. Even after a miscarriage, if the fetus body had some sort of physical development, so if the fetus looked like it was a baby, then the same ruling would apply. And in the case of twins, then the blood that exits after the first baby is considered. It has no minimum duration, while its maximum duration is 40 days. Any bleeding after 40 days is considered istihada. Right? Records of lochia lengths must be kept also. Why do lochia records need to be kept? Because it may be a case that she had a miscarriage previously, or she had a baby 2 years before and it was for 30 days. She only bled for 30 days. Remember, the maximum is 40, she bled for 30 days. So in a situation like this, if she bleeds past 30 days, she knows now that her lochia was 30 days. Anything else now is abnormal bleeding. The ruling of postpartum bleeding is that of menstruation. Therefore, the following cases are considered to be abnormal bleeding. Any bleeding of a pregnant woman, even bleeding during delivery before most of the baby has exited. So this is a technical point here now. If she starts to bleed before the baby has exited, or even if the baby is exiting, that is now considered abnormal bleeding and not lochia, because remember we said lochia is when most of the baby has exited. So why is this important to know? Because the obligation to pray still remains on her, even in this state. It's very difficult. No one's expecting her to make a perfect prayer, but it may be a case that she will just have to lie there and pray lying down. And no one's making slight of this huge event that's occurring in her life, this huge physical exertion upon her, this sometimes life-threatening exertion upon her of delivering a baby. The obligations of prayer still stand, and there are dispensations in place to make things easy for her. Bleeding after delivery for more than 40 days, so we mentioned lochia, the maximum period, it's got no minimum length, the maximum is 40 days. So anything past 40 days is considered abnormal bleeding. If she bleeds past her habit in either menstruation or postpartum bleeding, and the bleeding exceeds the maximum duration, in that case the bleeding after the duration of a habit is considered abnormal bleeding. Any bleeding of a girl that has not yet reached adolescence, abnormal bleeding. Abnormal bleeding takes the ruling of a continuous nosebleed. It does not prevent fasting, prayer, sexual intercourse or tawaf. If such bleeding continues for the duration of an entire prayer time, then the woman must perform wudu at the entrance of each fard prayer time, just like someone with chronic urinary incontinence, constant diarrhea, constant gas release, or continuous bleeding from any part of the body. That is, she takes the legal ruling of someone with a chronic problem, excused from having to make wudu after each occurrence of that problem. So let's have a look at this in more detail. There are 3 conditions for one to be categorized as chronically excused. Our author says, the condition of establishing the excuse, which as stated above is for the excuse or to continue for the duration of an entire prayer time, such that the person is unable to make wudu and perform the ritual prayer without the occurrence of the excuse. Afterwards, the person is considered chronically excused, therefore he may pray any amount of fard or nafil prayers after having performed wudu despite the occurrence of that excuse. The wudu performed in such a state is invalidated only by the expiration of the prayer time or by any other invalidator of wudu for which the person is not excused. Let's break this down. The condition, let's have a look at these two and then we break it down. The condition of continuity of the excuse, which is the occurrence of the excuse in every prayer time afterwards, even if only once in that prayer. And the condition to be no longer excused, which is for a prayer time to elapse without a single occurrence of that excuse. Right, now let's break that down. Basically, the author is saying there are 3 conditions: affirmation, continuation, and termination. Affirmation, what's affirmation? The excuse must last an entire prayer time, no time for minimum ablution. So for example, somebody may have a problem with incontinence, urine incontinence, where they cannot hold their urine in. They've got a constant leak. Or they've got a gas problem, they've got a stomach upset, they release gas. No matter what they do, no matter what they try, they cannot stop themselves from releasing gas. So they have to try. So in a situation of gas, it would be sit down on the floor. Does that make your situation better? Or if it's blood, try to stem it. A nosebleed, for example, right? You could be there for a long time and the nosebleed just won't stop. In a situation like that, the excuse needs to have transpired the whole time. The whole period of a prayer, the excuse must have remained. If you have to sit down and pray, then sit. If you can't for a whole prayer time, then you are excused now. Make ablution and ignore whatever happens. So in a situation like this, whatever happens now, just make ablution, even if you carry on bleeding, even if you can't hold your gas in, even if your urine is still leaking. There's an excuse now. You're known as somebody who was excused. You basically make wudu and start to pray, start to read Quran, and everything else that needs to be done with wudu you are now allowed to do. The continuation must be seen in a prayer time even once. So if every prayer time, now you've got this problem. Now you don't need to worry about, oh, you need to keep checking, or I'm not sure, what can I do because I don't know, I think I can hold it in. Well, how do you know? Right? You may go through 3/4 of the prayer time and then you find that it's impossible for you to hold it in, or the nosebleed starts again, or the urine has leaked again. So this creates hardship. Right? It means again you're going to make wudu. So in this situation, the excuse must have the excuse must have happened once in a prayer time. So let's say between Fajr and Dhuhr it happened 10 times. Then between Dhuhr and Asr it happened 5 times. And then between Asr and Maghrib it happened only once. Right? So if it's happening only once, even towards the end of the prayer time now, you're still excused, because it's called a continuation of the excuse. And only when you go through a complete prayer time without it happening, then now the excuse is terminated. An entire prayer time must be free from the excuse. Thank you very much for attending. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.